Just when the House of Windsor seemed to settle into a new rhythm, King Charles drops a decision so shocking it echoes through the royal halls. A private order signed under candlelight, an unprecedented transfer of the historic Duke of Edinburgh title. But it's not Edward who will bear it. It's James. Edward? Frozen out without warning? Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. It began with silence, the kind that carries weight. A silence that hung in the air like the calm before a thunderstorm, inside a study where history was quietly rewritten. The heavy door to the king's private quarters had been closed for hours. Only a few aides moved in hushed tones, eyes lowered, knowing something irreversible was about to unfold. Under the faint glow of a desk lamp, King Charles lifted his pen. His face was unreadable. His hand, however, was steady, too steady, some would say, as it moved across the paper, each signature stroke sealing what many would call an emotional betrayal. The Duke of Edinburgh title, long spoken of as Edward's inheritance, was being redirected. The ink had barely dried before the shockwaves began. What came next was a strange form of courtesy, formal yet cryptic. Edward, ever the dutiful brother, received a message through official channels. A simple summons. The king would like to speak privately about the future of the title. No explanation, no urgency. But it came wrapped in something far colder detachment. He sensed immediately that this was not the conversation he had long anticipated. This wasn't the fulfillment of a legacy, it was the rewriting of one. Behind the walls, Charles had confided in only one close advisor, someone known for their quiet ruthlessness. In a conversation laced with tension, Charles reportedly muttered, "This will define the future, not the past." It was a chilling phrase, one that erased sentiment in favor of strategy. The advisor nodded, not questioning the direction, only calculating the consequences. There would be backlash. But the die had been cast. As news of the signed order began to trickle through the internal staff, palace corridors became rivers of whispers, tense glances between officials, sudden closed-door meetings, and protocol staff working late into the night. Something was unfolding beneath the surface. Those closest to Edward felt the shift but said nothing, either out of confusion or loyalty. But loyalty doesn't mask truth, it only delays the reckoning. One aide, long sympathetic to Edward, confided in a friend, "He doesn't know. He still thinks it's his. It's cruel." Amidst this rising tension, one name quietly surfaced again and again: James. Young, poised, and blissfully unaware of the storm his name was about to stir. The shift wasn't just in title, it was generational. James represented youth, image, modernity. To the eyes of the palace's new power structure, he was the perfect symbol for a monarchy aiming to shed its aging traditions. But to those who remembered promises made by Prince Philip himself, it was a betrayal of blood and memory. But before Edward even learns the full truth, whispers inside the palace start painting a picture far more sinister than a simple succession choice. For decades, Prince Edward believed he would inherit the Duke of Edinburgh title, a promise from his father, the late Prince Philip. But when palace aides begin scrubbing his name from official drafts, Edward realizes something horrifying. He has been erased from his own legacy. It wasn't just a hope, it was a spoken assurance. Prince Philip, stern but principled, had looked his youngest son in the eye and told him plainly, "When the time comes, it will be yours." "You've earned it, Edward." That moment had never left him. Through years of faithful service, Edward clung to those words like a quiet oath, a private contract between father and son sealed not by signature, but by loyalty. While others chased titles or fame, Edward remained in the shadows, the quiet royal, steady and unshakable. But nothing in the palace is ever truly guaranteed, not even a father's word. Whispers had started weeks before. First, it was an invitation left off an internal memo. Then his title appeared inconsistently on diplomatic briefings. Still, Edward dismissed it until one morning. An aide cautiously placed a document on his desk. It was a proposed lineage chart for public release. The name printed beside future Duke of Edinburgh? James, Viscount 7. Not him. Not Edward. At first he thought it was a mistake. Then realization crept in like frost, cold, sharp and paralyzing. He wasn't forgotten. He was being removed. His team, usually reserved, began to ask quiet questions. A few ceremonial responsibilities had already been reassigned without explanation. The engagement at the Naval College, gone. His speech for a legacy youth initiative cancelled. One assistant confessed they'd been directed to redirect ceremonial focus to the next generation. A phrase that sounded innocuous until you understood its weight. The truth was undeniable now. The transition had already begun behind his back. At a formal reception at Windsor, Anne noticed something different. Edward, who usually carried himself with composed calm, seemed distant, withdrawn. He avoided eye contact, nodded without warmth, and left early. Anne, never one for dramatics, pulled him aside. "What's going on?" she asked. Edward said little, just a brief nod toward the gathering crowd. "Apparently not much," he said flatly, and walked away. That's when she knew something was deeper. Why wrong? But it was the confrontation with Charles that turned confusion into heartbreak. In a rare moment of candor, Edward stood in the king's private quarters and spoke plainly. "Is this how brothers speak to each other?" His voice wasn't angry, it was wounded. Charles, surrounded by a cold wall of advisors and silent protocols, offered only a diplomatic response. "Edward, times are changing." It was a dismissal masked as understanding, a betrayal dressed in royal language. But Edward isn't the only one caught in the storm behind closed doors. Sophie begins connecting dots, and what she uncovers will shake her faith in the system. Sophie, Countess of Wessex, has stood by her husband for decades, but now she watches him unravel, humiliated and ignored. When she hears James has been named Duke without Edward's consent, she doesn't cry. She plots. She had always been the calm within the storm, but this was different. When Edward returned from the meeting with Charles, his face pale and his voice hollow, Sophie didn't ask questions. She simply listened. He told her everything, not in anger, but in the quiet, cracking tone of a man who had just watched his legacy taken from his hands. And Sophie, watching the weight settle on his shoulders, felt something within her ignite. This wasn't disappointment. This was betrayal, and betrayal demanded action. While Edward wrestled with his sense of dignity, Sophie began moving through the palace like a ghost, silent, focused and dangerous. She arranged a discreet meeting with a trusted legal advisor, someone who had handled estate protocol for the royal family for years. She didn't go through the usual channels. This had to remain off the record. The questions she asked were sharp, deliberate and pointed. She wanted to know how the title transfer had been orchestrated, and more importantly, when. What the advisor revealed stunned her. There had been a clause, buried deep within royal documentation, that allowed the reigning monarch to override verbal commitments if a formal writ had not been enacted before the predecessor's death. Prince Philip's word to Edward, though heartfelt and sincere, had never been formally recorded, and Charles had exploited that silence with precision. The more she uncovered, the more furious she became. But Sophie knew emotion alone wouldn't fix this. She needed strategy. She reached out to the one person she knew would understand the weight of what was unfolding, Princess Anne. Their relationship had always been one of cautious respect, but in this moment, they were united by a shared understanding of injustice. Behind closed doors, Sophie laid out what she'd found. Anne, never one for melodrama, simply folded her arms and said, "This isn't about James, it's about control." A pact was formed not with words, but with intent. Later that evening, in a private study, Sophie read the official directive assigning the title to James. As she turned each page, her hands began to tremble. N.O.T. from fear but rage. And then, without hesitation, she slammed the folder shut, the sound echoing in the silence like a gunshot. She turned to her aide and said, "If they're giving it to James, it won't be without my terms." The palace had underestimated her resolve. They had seen a supportive wife, but now they would see something else, a mother, a strategist, and a woman who would not be silenced. While Sophie plans a quiet counter, James stumbles upon the truth he was never meant to see. He was just a teenager caught in royal shadows until he opened a drawer in his father's study and found a sealed letter. It wasn't addressed to him, but it would define him. Inside, a truth he wasn't ready for. James had grown up in the quiet margins of monarchy, far from the spotlight that consumed his older cousins. He'd never hungered for titles, nor had he chased lineage like a crown of destiny. But curiosity, that dangerous and innocent force, often finds its way into royal blood. One quiet morning, while wandering through his father's study, James came across a drawer he'd never noticed before, locked, but not fully closed. What he found inside was not a document meant for public display. It was a letter, aged and sealed, but its weight was unmistakable. The handwriting was firm. And the signature, Philip? He hesitated before opening it. Something told him this wasn't his to read, but another part older, sharper, whispered that it already belonged to him in some intangible way. As his eyes moved across the page, the air around him seemed to tighten. The words were personal, intimate, and laced with meaning. When the time comes, Prince Philip had written to Edward, the title is yours, not just because of duty, but because of the man you are. Every line that followed carried warmth, pride, and an unmistakable finality. The letter made one thing painfully clear. The Duke of Edinburgh title had always been intended for Edward. For James, the realization hit like a storm. The title he was now being groomed to accept wasn't a gift, it was a diversion. He hadn't earned it. He hadn't even asked for it. And suddenly, it felt more like a burden than an honor. Conflicted and shaken, he carried the letter to his mother. When he showed it to Sophie, her silence said more than any royal statement ever could. Her eyes welled with emotion, and for the first time in a long time, she faltered. James, still holding the letter, asked, "Why didn't anyone tell me?" Sophie's voice cracked as she replied, "We were protecting you. From the politics, from the weight, from the truth." But James no longer wanted protection. What he wanted was understanding. What he needed was clarity. He began to question everything. Was this title his to accept? Or was he simply being used to fulfill an agenda that ignored legacy, family, and truth? His once simple world was now layered with consequence. And in that complexity, a new question formed. If accepting the title meant denying his grandfather's last wish, then who was he really serving? But while James grapples with guilt, the throne's power brokers close in to protect the king's decision. Not all royal decisions are made with heart. In the corridors of Buckingham, the decision to bypass Edward wasn't just personal, it was strategic. And the people pulling the strings aren't wearing crowns. While the outside world focused on ceremonies and smiles, inside the palace walls, a different kind of monarchy was operating, one led not by tradition, but by optics. The advisory circle closest to King Charles had grown sharper, younger, and far more ruthless. They weren't interested in sentiment or past promises. Their mission was singular: reshape the face of the monarchy for the next generation, no matter the cost. And in their eyes, Prince Edward, for all his quiet dignity, represented a fading chapter. One advisor put it bluntly in a closed meeting: Edward is too careful, too reserved. The public won't rally behind a man they barely know. We need a face they can grow into. We need James. That statement didn't just hang in the air, it rewrote everything. The conversation quickly evolved from preference to persuasion. James, though still young, was unblemished by scandal, untouched by the battles that had scarred older royals. He had no tabloid baggage, no public stumbles, and most importantly, he could be shaped into the modern symbol they needed. In contrast, Edward, steadfast and sincere, had remained out of the spotlight for too long. To the advisors, that made him forgettable. In this cold calculation, legacy was less valuable than malleability. Charles, initially resistant, was not without his moments of weakness. And in one such moment, perhaps late at night, overwhelmed by decisions piling onto an aging reign, he listened. The advisors played their cards carefully. They framed it as a way to secure stability, to safeguard the throne's future image. And in a private moment where doubt lingered and fatigue blurred memory, the king signed the decree. That signature, drawn in ink but soaked in consequence, changed everything. It was done, and once signed, it was guarded fiercely. But not all documents were treated equally. Among the advisory group, There was awareness, dangerous awareness, that Prince Philip had left behind personal notes, letters and records that confirmed his intent for Edward to inherit the title. These were not official, but they were powerful. They carried sentiment, authority. If released, they could turn public perception in Edward's favour. And so, quietly, those documents were sealed, relocated, or simply disappeared from circulation. Lost in archival transitions, one aide explained to a curious staffer. But they weren't lost. They were hidden. Unbeknownst to the council, someone had been listening. Anne, ever the silent sentinel, overheard a conversation in the West Wing, two advisors whispering about neutralizing sympathy risks tied to Philip's outdated wishes. It wasn't just a betrayal, it was a manipulation of history. And in that instant, something in Anne shifted. She had remained neutral, hoping time would correct the injustice. But hearing her father's legacy dismissed like a strategic nuisance changed everything, and Anne's next move? A confrontation that even Charles didn't expect. She's known as the no-nonsense Princess Royal, but Anne's silence masks a blade. And when she finds Edward alone, defeated, she decides the time for quiet support is over. Her next move? A direct audience with the king. She hadn't intended to find him there. Edward stood alone in one of the palace's quieter corridors, eyes fixed on a portrait that had hung in the same place for decades. Prince Philip, stern and commanding, his gaze frozen in paint, forever watching. Anne paused before approaching, sensing the weight in Edward's stillness. She said nothing at first. He didn't turn around, but then he whispered, almost inaudibly, "Do you think he'd be proud?" It wasn't a rhetorical question, it was raw, and it hit her harder than she expected. That one sentence, spoken with so much defeat, broke something in her. In a sudden flash of memory, Anne saw Philip turning toward her in their youth, nodding at Edward across a courtyard and saying, "He's the one who sees the world as I do. He's my mirror." And now that mirror had been shattered, Anne had always played by her own code. She respected the institution but didn't cower to it. Still, what she did next was unprecedented even by her standards. She bypassed protocol, ignored the scheduling hierarchy, and demanded to see her brother, the king. Charles hesitated, the aides scrambled, but she insisted. When she entered the room, Charles looked up, surprised by her storm-like presence. She wasted no time. "We need to talk, not as royals, as siblings." There was no warmth in her tone, only fire. The exchange that followed was anything but civil. Anne's words were precise, unrelenting. She spoke not as a subject of the crown, but as a daughter of the man whose legacy had been discarded. "You betray him," she said. "You betray father's memory. You know what he wanted. You know." Charles, visibly tense, pushed back. "This is about evolution, Anne. It's not betrayal. It's progress. The future demands we adapt." But Anne wouldn't yield. "No," she snapped. "This isn't about the future. It's about convenience. It's about erasing someone who never asked for power, but who earned the right to it through loyalty." The room thickened with silence. Charles tried to maintain his composure, but Anne's final blow left no room for retreat. She walked to the door, turned once more, and said with icy certainty, "Then history will remember this betrayal, not the headlines, not the titles, the truth." And with that, she was gone. But as the siblings clash, another storm brews, and it's coming from the public. The royal watchers have spoken, and this time, their fury won't be silenced. Social media erupts as fans of Edward, loyal to his understated grace, accuse the monarchy of erasing one of its quietest heroes. It began as a whisper, a ripple across the timelines of royal enthusiasts and loyalists. But within hours, it exploded into a digital uprising. Across platforms, voices emerged sharp, emotional, unrelenting. The hashtag surged to the top of trending charts. Hashtag justice for Edward, hashtag Duke debacle, hashtag loyalty erased. What had started as quiet confusion had transformed into collective outrage. Users dug into archives, unearthing clips of Edward's quiet contributions, his decades of public service, and most heartbreakingly, the moment he was publicly praised by Prince Philip as the steady hand of Windsor. Suddenly, the overlooked brother became the symbol of institutional disregard. Os resurfaced, one in particular, igniting the internet like dry grass to flame. Edward and Sophie on their wedding day, smiling softly beneath modest grandeur, was reposted with captions that cut deep, the forgotten loyalists. It became a digital protest banner, shared by millions, accompanied by scathing commentary accusing the monarchy of rewriting its own family history for image over integrity. But the backlash wasn't just sympathy, it was fury. People demanded answers, and the palace, historically stoic, found itself cornered in a way it hadn't anticipated. The ire didn't stop with the decision-makers. James, young and largely silent, became an unintended target. Strangers began attacking him online, accusing him of theft, betrayal, and entitlement. Posts flooded in, questioning his merit, his silence, even his innocence in the matter. And while Sophie and Edward remained composed in public, those close to the family revealed that James had gone quiet, withdrawn, overwhelmed by a wave of scrutiny he never asked for. Inside the palace, panic erupted. Charles's press secretary, already burdened with defending recent changes, scrambled to construct a narrative that could calm the rising storm. But every statement only added fuel. A particularly tone-deaf response, suggesting that modernization sometimes requires difficult choices, was instantly torn apart online. Critics called it condescending, cold, and out of touch. Editorials poured in from every major outlet, but one line from a Times columnist landed hardest: "This isn't modernization. This is erasure wrapped in a gold seal." Then came the leak. The BBC reported from an unnamed palace insider that Edward had in fact been completely blindsided by the decision. There had been no warning, no consultation, just silence, then replacement. The story broke during prime time, and within minutes the palace's already crumbling defense collapsed. What had been a quiet internal shift now roared across headlines around the globe. The phrase "the Crown's coldest move" became the title of news segments, podcast episodes, and late-night commentary alike. Now, with the palace in damage control. Roll mode, Charles makes one final desperate move, and it doesn't go as planned. As headlines rage and family wounds deepen, Charles faces the mirror of consequence. Was the decision truly about legacy or something more personal? Behind the walls of Balmoral, the king reflects on a brother he once admired and a son who never asked for this. Retreat had once been a luxury. Now it felt like an obligation. Balmoral, with all its quiet beauty and austere stillness, offered no escape from the echoes of what had been unleashed. Alone in the study, Charles turned away from the noise of press briefings and tightened calendars. For the first time since signing the transfer, he was left with nothing but the silence of his own thoughts. The fury online, the disappointment from Anne, the heartbreak in Edward's eyes, it had all landed heavier than anticipated. This wasn't how legacy was supposed to feel. This wasn't the future he'd envisioned, and yet it was entirely of his making. In a rare moment of vulnerability, he turned to Camilla. She listened carefully as he asked, "Did I go too far?" The question was stripped of ceremony, raw and human. Her response was careful, but her eyes revealed what words didn't. Doubt, regret. It was a moment of truth between two people who had built a life amid 1,000 storms. But even love can't shield a man from the reflection in his brother's eyes. And now, that reflection looked an awful lot like shame. Memories returned unbidden. Childhood laughter in the garden. Edward, the quiet one, chasing butterflies while the others chased praise. Charles remembered their father saying once, with rare tenderness, "Edward's the heart of this family. He listens more than he speaks." That's a strength, not a weakness. Those words, long buried beneath years of duty, now struck with unforgiving clarity. What had he done to that heart, and for what gain? An advisor, one of the few who hadn't fled from the PR catastrophe, offered a grim summary. "You've made a future king, yes, but you've lost a brother." The phrase lingered in the room like a wound no title could heal. Even worse, James had become a casualty of the Crown's calculation. A sealed envelope had arrived that morning from Windsor. No announcement, no demands, just a note from James to his grandfather. The contents were unknown, but the message was clear. The boy didn't want this like this. Later that night, Charles returned to his private quarters. He sat down with a photograph of his father, standing tall in naval uniform, pride sharp in his eyes. Charles stared at it for a long time, and then, barely above a whisper, he said, "Forgive me." Whether it was meant for Philip, for Edward, or for himself only he knew. But it was a moment stripped of robes, titles, and defense. Just a man crumbling under the cost of a decision dressed as duty. But the story doesn't end in sorrow, it pivots to something far more complex, a family trying to rebuild from fractures, left in gold-embossed ink. Months later, an image surfaces that silences critics, Edward and James walking side by side at a royal event. No press release, no fanfare, just two men carrying the weight of legacy and perhaps building something new from the wreckage. What began in silence found its answer in silence. No statements, no palace announcement, just a quiet knock on the door at Bagshot Park. James stood there, not as a title holder or heir to controversy, but as a son carrying the weight of a name he hadn't asked for. Edward opened the door, uncertain at first, but as he stepped aside to let James in, it became clear this wasn't a confrontation. It was something far more sacred. It was a reckoning. They sat by the fireplace, where years of duty had often muted personal truths. No cameras, no aides, just father and son. The words came slowly at first. James, eyes lowered, spoke with sincerity. "I never wanted this to hurt you. I didn't even understand it until it was too late." His voice cracked under the weight of what had been unspoken for too long. Edward looked at him, no longer through. The eyes of a man passed over, but as a father seeing his son struggle under the burden he never should have borne. "Then don't let it change you," Edward said quietly. "Wear it with grace, not to prove anything to them, but to prove something to yourself." In that moment, something shifted. It wasn't closure, it was understanding. A fragile, hard-earned peace between two men forever tied by name and blood, now united by the silent agreement to carry forward with integrity. Days later, without warning or ceremony, they appeared side by side at a royal function. The press, caught off guard, scrambled for context, but there was none. Just a photo, no smiles, no gestures, only presence. The image went viral within minutes, shared not for scandal but for what it represented: reconciliation, strength, and most importantly, dignity. That single moment reframed the entire narrative. The boy once targeted by rage was now seen walking beside the man once cast aside. There were no speeches, but there didn't need to be. The crown may choose, but family decides who wears it with honor. As history closes this chapter, a quiet truth emerges. Legacy isn't always inherited, sometimes it's forgiven. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.